Welcome to Around the Empire, the show that takes you around the U.S. empire. I'm your host, Dan Wright.
I'm your host, Joanne Leon.
And on today's show, July 12th, 2018, we speak with Jim Kavanagh, editor and writer at The Polemicist. His work is also published at Counterpunch, and he's a frequent guest on the Loud and Clear radio show. We spoke with Jim about the Trump-Putin summit and the future for a Middle East grand bargain. Here is that interview.
Jim Kavanagh, welcome to Around the Empire.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, Jim.
Hi, Dan.
It's great to have you. In the lead up to the Trump-Putin meeting in Helsinki, there's been a cacophony of voices, most of them negative, ominous, and cautionary. And it's hard to discern what Trump's real policies or his goals are for this meeting. But there have been some articles in the media about it, and we'll talk about a few of those. There's also one particular voice that I've singled out as possibly signaling what Trump might try to do, assuming that he'll be relying on the neoconservative War Party advisors for guidance. And that voice is, believe it or not, Lindsey Graham, who often blurts out the neoconservative War Party game plan. And there's a common theme in what he says and in what some of the recent articles we've read speculate about this grand bargain or rebalancing of power in the Middle East, driven by the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. And we'll start out with an audio clip of Lindsey Graham. This is last Sunday on a Fox News interview. He had just returned from a meeting with Turkey, and he talks about, what he thinks has to happen in this meeting.
Meanwhile, President Trump will meet one-on-one with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki next Monday. Bloomberg reports the Kremlin is working with the U.S. to have a deal that the president will accept. They say Putin has agreed in principle to U.S. and Israeli demands that Iranian-backed forces in southern Syria be kept away from Israel's border, replaced with troops loyal to the government in Damascus. That's according to two Kremlin advisors. Would you recommend the president agree to that deal?
Given Russia's behavior, absolutely not. Russia was supposed to make sure that Assad had no chemical weapons. The last thing you can rely upon is the Russians to take care of American and Israeli interest. There's a deal to be had in Syria. Our troops in northeastern Syria, working with the Syrian Democratic Forces, Arabs and Kurds, have demolished ISIS. And if we stay there, we have about 2,000 troops, ISIS won't come back. If we stay in northeastern Syria, Iran can't march from Tehran to Beirut. I don't trust the Russians to implement any agreement when it comes to the Iranians, but there is a way to break Iran away from Russia away from Iran, but no way can be achieved without us staying there. Our presence in northeastern Syria is an insurance policy against Assad taking over Syria and ISIS coming back and the Iranians owning the whole region.
How do you balance the cooperation that we need with Russia right now on some things with the concerns that we have with Russia on many other fronts? And how would you recommend President Trump approach that meeting next Monday in Helsinki? It will be his first one-on-one with Putin.
Well, first, when Putin denies that he was involved in our election in 2016, reject the denial. Challenge him. Don't let him deny the obvious. They're still trying to disrupt the 2018 election cycle. When it comes to Syria, we need to be partnering with Turkey to make sure that we can maintain a presence in northeastern Syria. At the end of the day, Iran is a weak economy. They've got problems in their own backyard. What we need to do is partner with Turkey and Russia and break Iran away. Iran has a different reason for being in Syria than most everybody else. Israel cannot tolerate Hezbollah and Iranian presence in Syria. If you leave Assad in power, the Arabs never will accept him, nor will the Syrian people. There's a way to get Russia pulled away from Iran, but we've got to have a presence in Iraq and Syria to be successful. In 2007, we lost 900 soldiers fighting in Iraq. In the last 3.5 years, we've lost 14. President Trump has done a good job of destroying ISIS and countering Iran. Our soldiers in Iraq and Syria are insurance policies against Iran domination and the rise of ISIS. If we keep this configuration in place, we've got some leverage regarding Russia and Iran.
So please tell me that's the end. Oh, thank God. I can't take any more of that.
So that's Lindsey. I think he's putting some of his own spin on that. And it also sounds kind of a lot like what the old plan was. I don't know about this
regime change. I mean, he's saying he said the Arabs won't accept Assad. I mean, I guess he means the Saudi paymasters. Who's he talking to?
Yeah, he brings that up, but that's kind of off the table at this point, unless there's a huge American invasion of some kind to go directly into Damascus. And I don't think anybody's going down for that. I'm going to be down with that. And the kinds of discussions that are going on between Netanyahu and Putin, as well as between Putin and whatever's going to happen with Trump, have to do with this issue of the Iranian presence in Syria. So that's one set of issues that really at this point, the Israelis, I think most people that I've read who are smart about this agree. The Israelis are kind of accepting that Assad's going to stay. And they're hoping that Russia will make some deal to get Iran not out of, at least away, not out of Syria, at least away from Israel, and make sure that Assad doesn't go past the border, doesn't try to get into the Golan Heights, not the border, because Golan Heights is part of Syria, but doesn't go past the line of demarcation with the Golan Heights, doesn't try to take back the Golan Heights, and doesn't interfere with Israeli ability to attack, in Syria, air attacks in Syria whenever they want. So that's what they're hoping Russia will get for them, and then they'll accept Assad.
Right, and they partnered with, from what at least one report I read, UAE and the Saudis. Apparently, this was part of this meeting with Eric Prince before the election, as the Russiagate investigation spurns in every different direction. Is that there was a thought that from the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, I guess Qatar before they got defriended, and Israel that they wanted Trump to work with Russia to help them contain Iranian influence. Right. So it looks like that's the grand strategy for them. It would seem.
Although and it was unclear. Everybody said it was Mohammed bin Saif, I think the Crown Prince of UAE. And I
think it's Abu Dhabi, which is different than different than Dubai, right?
Everybody said they weren't sure where this came from. It might just have been an idea of his, and I suspect it was an idea of his that he's trying to promote. And the Israelis would like to do it too. And once they got to the point where they saw they're not going to get rid of Assad, this is the best option for them. So the question there really is, what is the role of the Russians? Are the Russians willing? Can they get Iran out of Syria? And Lavrov has said, and even the Israelis have said, we know that you really can't force Iran out of Syria. I don't think there's going to be a Hezbollah presence in Syria. There's going to be an Iranian presence in Syria, but they're going to keep it try and get it to keep at a distance. What's interesting about that is Russia starts to become the mediator in all this, the trusted mediator, because really everybody at this point knows that the agent you can't trust here is the United States. They've dumped the agreement they had with Iran, not just their agreement, but the agreement of 7 other countries. And so Russia is becoming a potentially trusted, the new honest broker in the Middle East. And that's one of the things the Americans don't like either. What struck me also about Lindsey Graham, because there were all this stuff about Assad going and the Iranians, what he was really pushing there, I think, and emphasizing is the 2,000, let's call that a minimum number because that's what they admit to, American troops in northeast Syria. And the Kurdish enclaves, the little enclaves the Americans are trying to carve out with Turkey, that they don't want to give back to Assad, okay? So that's what he's trying to say, okay, this is what we have to stay in that redoubt, which is not to protect from us, from ISIS and the jihadis, but it's a redoubt that the Americans have to keep the jihadis alive in there.
Right. To make sure the jihadis don't lose.
Exactly. As a possible future force against Assad. So he's saying really what we should be focusing on is getting Turkey and Russia to accept the American military presence in Iran, because we can't let Assad take over his own country.
Yeah, he did say that.
His own country.
Yeah.
That was one of my favorite quotes in there. He said, where is it?
We can't let Assad take over Syria. And it was like,
yeah,
he's the government. What do you mean take over? He's the recognized government. You're talking about these jihadists you want to take over. I mean, Lindsey Graham's, I can't imagine every neocon is this much in the tank or such a Likudnik, but apparently and also they're trying to square the circle with, trying to get close to Trump by also putting out a foreign policy that seems to contradict it, rhetorically at least. I'm amazed that it's possible to say these things. I wonder if he doesn't hear himself talk, or I don't know what he does, but this agenda he has, we're going to stay there for, indefinitely, and we're going to act as kind of a buffer group, meaning U.S. forces he's talking about.
Oh, yeah, America.
This is like exactly what nobody wants in this country.
What Obama hesitated to talk about, even though he started to put them in. And everybody wants to say, oh, we never did anything in Syria. It's craziness. But, thousands of American troops admitted, south of 2,000, and that's probably at least twice as many.
And he's saying, yeah, no, we're not many of them are getting killed. So, we got to keep them there, Yeah.
They're not getting killed yet. That's the other thing. Once the war, which Assad looks like apparently will win soon definitively, although he's probably already arguably prevailed. Once that settles down and peace is made, which these people have done everything to stop from happening, those U.S. troops are going to be a much more appetizing target for the many different people in the region.
Well, that's true. I don't think Assad is going to go directly after them, and I don't think the Russians are going to go directly after them. But look what happened in southern Syria around Dara. The regime and the Russians have managed this really quite intelligently. They shrunk gradually the sphere of control of the rebels, and they forced them eventually to give up. And they've given up, and they've handed over huge amounts of weapons, including American weapons, heavy weapons from the United States, because the presence of the Russians and maybe Trump's little ideology of what the hell are we doing there, which he was saying during the election, has they put out this line to the rebels in the South: don't count on us. The Americans did. Don't count on military support from us. Once that happened, they knew they were going to be defeated. And the Israelis are not itching to have a full-scale war with Syria, and this is Syrian territory, so they've kind of given up on the South. So what Graham is really saying is we can't do that in the North. Now, what the strategy would be for caging the Americans and Turks and trying to undermine their presence in the North, it's going to be that what do these people really do for the Kurds? The Kurds, are going to find out that they've made a deal with the devil that isn't getting them anything. And gradually, the hope is, I think, that towns and villages we want to come back into Syria. And that's what they hope for. But as long as Americans are in there, as long as this war is still going on, and it is, as long as there are American troops certainly in the air, let alone jihadis who are paid for by the Americans, then it's not over yet. And they just want something there that's going to be a constant pressure on the Assad government.
Which is unfortunate for the American imperial objective here, because what they're actually doing with this alliance and trying to create this, I guess, buffer zone or enclave is they're actually extremely irritating Turkey, who is, I always get the impression that Erdogan and the others are like 2 seconds away from ordering a full scale, like, God damn these Kurds, just go in there and get them.
Yeah.
Like Afrin is kind of punitive, or it's kind of a show of strength. Maybe it's more symbolic, but they're not going to accept this buffer state for various reasons. So there's so many different factions within the dynamic of the Syrian civil war who would be completely opposed to this, that the idea that you could just have special forces there and suffer very low casualties indefinitely is a crazy idea. And it only makes sense if you're Machiavellian, and the neocons typically are, but I don't know if Lindsey Graham has thought this through, is that you're hoping that they attack the Americans soldiers, they get killed, and that proves a rallying cry for a larger U.S. commitment. So that this holding pattern is not going to last much longer. So either you're hoping that these U.S. forces are bait, so you can do a full scale invasion, or you're just or you're looking to get out. That's the part that I think they haven't. I don't know if it's on purpose or how can you possibly believe this, that they can just stay there indefinitely?
Well, the Kurds are also talking to the Syrian government. I don't know if it's clear yet what they're agreeing to, but they can see the writing on the wall. And I think the core issue, and Lindsay does touch on that, but then he pollutes his message with a bunch of sort of old policies that that have already failed and that were, his policies to begin with. So he kind of like drug that into what he said. But the core issue, I thought, of what he was talking about was, what is called the resistance axis, which is, it didn't exist before the Syrian war. It was actually created as a result, another unintended consequence of United States and Saudi and Israeli foreign policy. What happened was, Syria and Iran got closer. They were already close allies, but they're closer. Hezbollah came to Syria's assistance. Russia came in. Now they're part of the resistance axis. And then Turkey became part of the Russia, Iran, Turkey, Syria, Hezbollah. And, they've been successful. And
they went from shooting down Russian jets to almost essentially being in a partnership, which is pretty crazy turn of events when you think about it.
Well, after the botched coup, right? The failed coup that happened. And, now the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Americans, the Israelis are looking at this and saying, holy, this can't happen. We can't allow this to remain. And so what Lindsay gives away is he says, we got to pull Iran away from Russia, and we got to, fix up our relationship with Turkey, which is basically, he's saying we have to repair the damage that we did with this Syrian war to begin with, this foolish, disastrous war that we pursued in the way we pursued it. And then, the fool, he throws in, but, he makes it clear he's still trying to regime change Assad.
But just in case, we need to break up this axis that formed from our regime attempt, but also we should still keep doing this regime attempt that created the axis.
Exactly. That's why this clip just made me, I don't know. I thought it was interesting.
The Turkey aspect of it is extremely, because they are completely unreliable to everybody. They've switched sides. I think, again, Putin played this very smartly and very calmly. He got his plane shot down. The Americans would have gone, we're going to kill all these. Look, we're going to deal with you. You're a country. We'll accept a certain line of baloney about you mean it or whatever, and let's think about what's going forward here. And it turned them around. It turned Turkey around, at least temporarily. Again, provisionally, I wouldn't count on Turkey. I wouldn't tell anybody to count on Turkey, but it creates a dynamic that's pulling it in all kinds of different directions, and it's going to be extremely difficult for the Americans to manage. Now,
and he shrugged off the death of his ambassador, who was assassinated in public. I mean, I was amazed that like two major incidents, and they kind of shrugged it off.
Yep. But he's playing a long game in a very smart way, and he's been very successable at it so far. And this is what one of the things that infuriates the Americans about it, because ultimately everybody in the region in the game is saying, well, we can see that this guy is not stupid. He's not impetuous. If he makes a deal, he's going to keep it, etc. And all the things you can't say about the United States. And that's what's dangerous for the Americans. Now, I'll say this. On the one hand, they did not get what they wanted entirely out of Syria at all. They did not get Assad regime gone, but they still did quite a lot of damage to Syria. And Syria is not Syria has not regained all its territory yet, and it's not quite clear how it is. And there are thousands of foreign troops on Syrian soil. And so Syria has been, in a certain sense, weakened. And the point of all of these things, from Iraq to Libya to Syria, was not to create something new, it was just to destroy these states and to weaken them, to take them off the board as opponents of Israel and Zionism, and as allies, of material and military allies of the Palestinian struggle. So on the one hand, they kind of achieved some of that in Syria. And the other hand, as everybody we're saying, Syria's been strengthened. Its army now is confident. And the Iranian forces have been fighting in Syria are now confident. They have military experience, and they won a huge battle. The Russians have come in, and for the first time, militarily, for the first time since the Cold War, shown that militarily they can prevent the Americans from doing anything they want militarily, and make them stop and think and interrupt the imperialist project in a very important way. So those are the contradictions of that, and it's very interesting to see because and I think what you mentioned, Joanne, about Iran, about Lindsey Graham talking about Iran, is that's the next target. They're not giving up on it. 80% chance there's going to be a war with Iran. They want to do it, and they're trying to figure out how to arrange some kind of end game in Syria that allows them to move forward with that.
Yeah, but Jim, here's the issue. Real quick to do a recap here of the last 10 years or so in the Middle East. Every time they've gone on these imperial adventures or weakening actions that did previously work, this goes back to the British and French, empires. We'll just weaken this group and this group. It's blown back on them. So Iraq, it's blown back on them, strengthened Iran, strengthened everyone they claimed didn't want in power. Libya, it's blown back. Syria, I think one of our previous guests said it was like the Third World War, except it was fought by proxy and the American empire got broke. I don't know if it's that I don't know if it was that massive, but like, how would you then go, well, let's do this again in Iran?
Because seriously, I got to say, this is not about anything that the American government says it's about. It's not about democracy. It's not about, because they're dictators or they kill their own people. And it's really not about anything. I hate to, I've got to say it. That's in the American interest. This is about Israel and Zionism. And this is about the Israelis. Iraq was a strong military state. Iraq gave a lot of money and a lot of support to the Palestinian resistance. That's gone. The Iraq War was a success from that point of view.
Oh,
Iraq is a mess. And they knew that by destroying Iraq, they'd strengthen Iran. Guess what? All the more reason to say we now got to go after Iran. Libya, they weren't going to turn Libya into a divide. They didn't care. Libya's gone. It's off the chess. It's off the board. As it was one of an economic and military, certainly economic support for the Palestinian resistance. It's gone. Countries that were in the resistance axis against Israel, and they've been destroyed systematically one by one. And there's 1.5 country left now. I'm saying they didn't get rid of Syria, but they still want to go to Iran. Iran is the big one.
Wow. It's an interesting, there's a coherence to it, especially when you look at now how all the Gulf states and everyone has essentially abandoned the Palestinians. We're now seeing sort of blatant, open, I don't want to say genocide, but certainly a crackdown on any kind of Palestinian freedom of movement, shooting, they can shoot down now civilians in cold blood. There's no real pushback from anyone in the region. Of course, not the United States, now that Trump's in charge, although not that I think the liberal Obama pushback was much of anything anyway. But that is one, at least a coherent logic to it. I wonder if we're giving them a little, but then what the hell is the U.S. doing going along with it? Because it's certainly not in our interest. It'd be just totally captured by Israel.
Yes. In the Middle East, American policy is Israeli policy. And the Americans have been following that plan. Because, I hate to tell you, but Israeli influence in the United States foreign policy establishment is huge.
Well, okay, so you're saying in this framework, the reason Iran has to be attacked is not necessarily to prevail over it or to even rebalance the Sunni-Shia divide, is simply to weaken a currently strong, coherent state and try to force it into a kind of anarchy that makes it very difficult to organize around resisting Israeli objectives.
Because as you say, they haven't quite succeeded in everything. Israel attacks Gaza and attacks Lebanon, but all that happens ends up is they build up Hezbollah. So now Hezbollah is one of the strongest resistance forces in the region. And Iran is the backbone of Hezbollah. And it's true. Iran supports Hezbollah. And so what they want to do now is by getting rid of Iran, they're not going to occupy Iran. They're not going to take it over. They're not going to turn it into a democracy. They're not going to have the women walking around with no veils and miniskirts. They're going to just destroy it as much as they can. They can't really It's a huge country. It's going to be very difficult, but they can bomb the crap out of it and destroy it and try to make it impossible for Iran to continue supporting Hezbollah. Hezbollah is what Israel's worried about from Iran.
Israel is obsessed with Hezbollah. I mean, the history. You can see why. Although, I mean, they're also the reason for Hezbollah. There wouldn't be a Hezbollah if it wasn't for Israel invading Lebanon, right? But Hezbollah, through this unintended consequences, blowback, whatever you want to call it, they're now not just a guerrilla force, right? They're an organized, mechanized military now. They are not only are they stronger, but they have more skills, they have more experience and broader experience. So yeah, but maybe just recently, I've started. Obviously, Israel has huge influence over our policy. I mean, that's obvious, but a lot of curtains have been pulled back during this Syrian war. And you can see, for instance, the Saudi-Israeli alliance. And then you have the United Arab Emirates, too, which they don't get a lot of attention, but they have enormous influence over us, too.
Particularly in D.C. Yeah, D.C. for sure.
And in this case, like this New Yorker article, in this case, the Saudis, the Israelis, and the United Arab Emirates are aligned. I think that may be a little oversimplified because they're not exactly, especially Saudi. I mean, they're not monolith, that's for sure. But in this case, supposedly they wanted a rapprochement between the United States and Russia, and it was all about this grand bargain where the United States and Russia could do this rebalancing of power in the Middle East and basically deal with Iran for them, right? I think that there's more. It's not just Israel pushing our policy. I think we also use Israel as another unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Middle East. And with the Saudis, there's so much there. It's the petrodollar. It's the control over the flow.
The arms deals. The arms deals are off the charts.
That whole laundering of the arms deals. So I don't think it's quite as simple as I once thought it was.
Well, and I will say this: the American policy, and this is a twist in this. The American policy toward Russia is not determined by Israel. I mean, and this is part of the contradiction that we're pointing at here: that Israelis, in some sense, have a good relationship with Russia, and this whole business that in these articles about the Emirates and the Israelis trying to get Trump to make a deal with Russia. Well, that's being resisted from within the American establishment for other reasons, for non-Zionist reasons. And so policy towards Russia is confrontational for other geopolitical...
long history, yeah.
...or world hegemonic regions that the Americans don't want to have Russia as a countervailing power in the world of any kind. So that's
yeah, good luck with that. Yeah, that is their objective. And what's interesting, let's just take, for example, that there is a Zionist or a stronger Israeli presence in the strategic thinking. I mean, if you look at Iraq, you look at Libya, and you look at Syria, even Syria, you see a pattern of knocking over imperially carved out states that always had these sectarian divisions anyway and were exacerbated by this attempt. Iran is a much different animal, in my mind, because it is a coherent group of people. I mean, back to Persia, if you like, but I think that's the kind of, knock out Saddam. Saddam was keeping a lot of things together. He was kind of a brutal glue for sure, keeping these various tribes together. I'm not so sure the Iranian people will necessarily, if they're attacked by Israel or other forces, just splinter so easily like you would in Libya, which was all these various weird tribal alliances that kept Gaddafi as kind of a paramountcy, if you like. I wonder if they're miscalculating again, actually, or although in your view, they're actually playing it rather well because these states have been weakened. So that's my only concern. I'm not sure Iran is not a colonial carve out, right? It's a real country, if you like. Do you agree with that at all?
That's a good point. And I do think Iran is going to be another kettle of fish altogether. It's going to be worse than Iraq, Syria, and Libya combined. Iran is a strong country. The people are not going to get into this. And all they can hope Again, all they can hope to do is blow as much crap up as they can and set them back 20 years, and that's what they're going to be looking to do. Now, what they're hoping is that when they start to do that, the Iranians won't have a counterattack that will cost the United States, because, that will kill a lot of Americans, because that's going to be a real problem. Americans are not, as you say, Joanne, there's 2,000 American troops, nobody cares because nobody's getting killed. Minute Americans start getting killed en masse, then all of a sudden everybody can say, wait, what the hell are we doing there? So can the Iranians sink an American aircraft carrier? Can they launch attacks on Israel? Israel cannot take thousands of civilian casualties. Can they launch attacks on Israel? This is what everybody's worried about.
They're also now threatening to shut down the straits,
Yeah, Strait of Hormuz. Yeah, which they're saying no oil is going to go through there. Can they do that even for 6 months in a way that's going to, and then when I wrote about this on my blog, it was like what the Americans want to make sure is, and this is where the Russia thing comes in. They want to make sure that the Russians know that the Americans, when they go after Iran, that the Russians know we're going to go after Iran, and if you come in, we'll go after you too. We don't care. So they want to scare the Russians off in advance. What the Iranians need before this happens is to try and make some deal with the Russians where the Russians say, we're your ally and we'll defend you if you're attacked. The Russians aren't going to do that. But that's, I think, the only thing that might stop an American attack on Iran. Because if they knew they were going to be having to fight the Russians too.
This is a strong alliance. It's a strong alliance that just beat us in Syria. Now, granted, we were reluctant to use all the force that we could have, but still, they won this war.
But isn't there a wild card? There's a wild card here also in terms of retaliation, and that is Hezbollah. Hezbollah is not just limited to the Middle East. They could easily attack the United States right at home, meaning there's an attack on Iran. It's with Israel and Russia. You will see Hezbollah agents, operatives throughout the world, including on continental United States, launch terrorist attacks in response. You could see things blow up in New York. You could see attacks in Los Angeles. So it's not a simple thing to say, well, you're just taking on the Iranian military. Hezbollah is a sword for them around the world.
Is that true, or is that propaganda?
I think it's very true. I think
genuinely
they will attack Israel. They will attack the Golan Heights. They will attack Israel, I think, and in a way that will cause casualties civilian casualties and casualties in the Israeli homeland. It's going to very quickly become a very big war.
Right. 2006 in Lebanon proved, I think, something about the Israeli resolve in these issues. It's there. But there's also people who are kind of like, well, why do we have to be at war all the time? There's, Likud is very dominant, and certainly the country's kind of going more right wing. So it is trending farther right, but there's not a lot of appetite for these incursions. 2006 and the Lebanon campaign was a failure, in my view, because domestic Israeli opposition undermined the goal. And I think you could see that kind of opposition materialize really quickly if suddenly there's missiles hitting Tel Aviv. So I'm not so sure the resolve is endless. It's really easy to shoot some unarmed people in Gaza or blockade them in where there's no, and the rockets get shot down with the Iron Dome or whatever. It's another thing to actually suffer serious casualties. And some people go, well, why can't we just get out of this? So I agree that it's questionable. I'm not so sure there's going to be an incredible Israeli resolve. And I also think Hezbollah can't be underestimated. And I don't know what happens if there's an attack on the U.S. soil. I don't know if that makes us go even crazier than we are right now, or it calms people down. I don't know what happens.
Yeah, I wasn't doubting you. I just had questions about those articles that I read. I didn't realize that Hezbollah was in places in South America and elsewhere. So I'm not doubting that they have a longer reach than most people knew about. But I thought that they were still their main power was still focused in as a defense force in Lebanon. But that doesn't say that they couldn't cause trouble, right? You don't
and
need
now a political party, right, Joanne?
Oh yeah, with a significant number of seats in their parliament. But
didn't the prime minister get kidnapped over that?
Oh my God!
Remember the Lebanese prime minister was kidnapped or something, or he wasn't kidnapped?
What a great show that was! Yeah.
Yeah, we did a whole episode on that.
I still don't know the real story about it. It's still confusing.
Right?
Yeah.
But they had to kind of let him go. It was because it was what was going to come of it for them? Remember, we knew what was going on. It just made the Saudis look ridiculous.
It didn't end up going too well, I don't think.
And it strengthened Hezbollah in Lebanon.
I mean, they weren't weakened, that's for sure. I don't think they significantly changed their number of seats in parliament, but they didn't lose any support, that's for sure. I think they gained some, if I remember right.
But the dynamic of what's going to happen if there's an attack on Iran from the United States is very dangerous. And I would, not only do I think there's an 80% chance that the United States will attack Iran sometime in the next couple of years, because that's what they want to do. But I think that when that happens, there's a 60 to 70% chance that nuclear weapons will be used relatively quickly.
Whoa, you think it'll go nuclear?
Yeah. I think because, as I say, if Israel is attacked in a significant way by missiles from Hezbollah in Lebanon, neither the United States nor Israel wants to take a lot of casualties. So what they know how to do is blow crap up. And what the Israelis will do, if the Americans don't, is drop a nuclear weapon in Iran and say, back the F off.
Whoa. That's an interesting, I did not think that would be the response. That's a very significant response. I guess it would, rather than take, I guess that does have a certain coherence to it as well, that they would actually take a nuclear action to prevent further damage.
If it becomes a big war and they start taking, all of a sudden the real insecurity of Israel and the real weakness of Israel becomes apparent. They're surrounded by 100 million people who don't like them. And if they start, losing, looking like they're losing the battle with Hezbollah, or, being forced back to stop, what are they going to do? They're going to stop fighting? You say, okay, we give up. We'll stop fighting.
Oh, you're saying, okay, so you're saying this is kind of almost a scenario for that movie, Some of All Fears, that with the earlier part, which was that the balance of power would shift. You're saying there would be a military battle and Israel would actually begin losing it.
But not winning is losing for Israel. They keep saying that, and they're right. That is, they can only win. They can only lose once. If there's a military battle against Iran in which Hezbollah attacks Israel with 1,000 missiles and start blowing up various places in Israeli cities, military targets in downtown Tel Aviv, which are military targets, the defense complex, defense headquarters, and starts causing thousands of Israeli casualties. What's the Israeli response to that going to be? To back off? To attack? To send thousands of troops into Lebanon, where they're going to have to fight and get killed? Or to say, this is the big war we've been waiting for. If we start backing off now, we're going to be put more and more into a corner. What we have to do is get rid of Iran in a decisive way, at least for the next 20, 30 years.
Or get the United States to do it for us.
They want us to do it for them, but maybe we'll drop a little bunker buster atomic bomb on Iran. Trump is making it easy to use these new tactical nuclear weapons.
And I think that's another thing that Lindsay's little interview sort of betrayed. It's that I think there's a realpolitik or a more, you can't really call them moderate, maybe more realistic faction who's trying to, through diplomacy, create this balance of power and do it. But of course, it's their main goal is for Russia to break ties or at least not be military allies with Iran. But then you also, have the more rabid ones who are openly, as you say, trying to wage war with Iran. But even the more moderate ones who say they're trying to create a balance of power, is it just because they're afraid of Iran that, that they think Iran has gotten too much power, they're expansionist or something like that? Or is it because they realize that they can't achieve their goals against Iran as long as Russia and Turkey are in this, resistance axis alliance with them? And I don't think any of these countries are stupid enough to fall for that kind of a thing. And then we have an interesting article in RT, which I did not send to you, Jim. I apologize. So what I'll do is I'll read it real quick. It's on RT. The title of it is Middle East Officials Flocking to Moscow. Is there a big deal to be made before Putin meets Trump? Moscow is awash. I'm reading from the article. Moscow is awash with Middle East movers and shakers, apparently eager to have a word with Vladimir Putin ahead of his meeting with Trump. Is there a big Middle East deal in the making? RT talks to analysts. Before having a face-off with his U.S. counterpart in Helsinki next week, President Putin is to have several high-profile meetings in Russia. There is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Ali Akbar Velayati, the foreign policy aide to Iran's supreme leader. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas will be in Moscow in time to watch the World Cup finals on Sunday and is expected to meet Putin. Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, the Emir of Qatar, will also be among the spectators, although whether he will talk to Putin is yet to be confirmed. Amid the flurry of visits, there's some speculation in the media that a grand deal between U.S. and Russia, which would involve rebalancing power in the Middle East, may come out of the Helsinki talks, and that regional players are making an 11th-hour bid to ensure their interests would be taken into consideration. Such a scenario is possible, but highly unlikely because it would be inconsistent with Russia's current policies in the Middle East. Grigory Lukyanov, a Middle East analyst and senior lecturer at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, told RT. And this is a quote from this Lukyanov guy. Quote, there are concerns in Damascus and Tehran that the course which Russia had in foreign policy over the past years may take a shift similarly to how it happened in the past, when in pursuit of some global agreement with the United States, Russia would sacrifice its Middle Eastern achievements and interests that it perceived as secondary, he said, unquote. The sentiment is particularly strong in the Iranian political circles, which view Moscow as unreliable and its interests inconsistent with those of Tehran, he said. Such concerns don't seem to be backed by facts and are inconsistent with Russia's own interests in the regions. One should not overestimate how much Donald Trump may realistically offer in Helsinki to have Russia make any major policy change, and how tempting this offer would be for Putin. Sergei Balsamov, a senior analyst at the Center for Crisis Society, a Moscow-based think tank, told RT. And here's a quote from him. Quote, the moods of America are like the moods of a very beautiful and rich but airheaded girl. Today you flirt with her, and the next day you find relations with that guy Iran spoiled. Such things require great care, and people in the Russian Foreign Ministry realize it well, he explained. And anyway, global issues cannot be solved Gorbachev style with a stroke of a pen, unquote. Russia's involvement in Syria, which changed the situation dramatically from the hopeless slide toward total disintegration in 2014 to the relative stability of today, is a major point of leverage for Moscow in regional politics, Balsamov said. Tactical considerations like the presence of pro-Iranian troops in southern Syria and Israel's combative reaction to it are of course important, but the really important issue for the country would be post-war reconstruction and who would pay for it. Lukyanov agrees that Moscow would win nothing from siding with either party involved in the Middle East. Russia's current policy in the region is to play its own game while taking into account the interests of other players. The meetings with Netanyahu and Velayati are most likely just meant to keep Putin up to date with the positions of Israel and Iran, respectively, he believes. At the moment, Russia sees a more prominent place for itself in the Middle East, but the role it is ready to play is limited compared to other global players, he said. Quote, Russia's strong point now is the ability and willingness to offer solutions to security problems. The U.S. failed in that regard in Iraq and some other places, Lukyanov said. But Russia cannot and is not trying to replace the U.S. as primary trade partner for Middle Eastern nations. The same is true about replacing China or Europe. Solving security issues requires constructive dialogue with stakeholders, and the Syrian experience is viewed by Russian leadership as more than constructive. Many people in Middle Eastern nations, Arab or otherwise, share this position, unquote, he added. So I thought that was interesting, a little perspective from people in Moscow and, Russia being sort of the linchpin for this whole thing. And
well,
I mean, boy,
interesting, and I don't know if you agree with this, Jim, is that basically they're saying there's really no good reason for us to get out of our current position in the Middle East for some stupid U.S. guarantee because the U.S. has no credibility. I mean, it's in so many words. I mean, I take RT as an official organ, so these guys who are talking from the ministry are kind of giving you a sense of the Russian position's official position. So, but what do you think?
Well, I think everybody's in that position now. They're saying we can't rely on the Americans, and they're not relying on the Russians, but they're trying to see if Russia can get these people to agree on something among themselves. And what everybody's been talking about here is Russia trying to get Syria to agree to get the Iranians out. And Russia's saying that we can't do it, but they probably can get Syria to agree to keep the Iranians out of southern Syria, keep the Hezbollah out of and Iranian troops and Iranian forces, Revolutionary Guard forces, whatever's there, out of southern Syria. And in exchange, this link that I sent you, Joanne, makes that.
Yeah. Talk about that for us. That was good.
Interesting point that in exchange, Netanyahu would give Syria something he has never given an Arab state that doesn't recognize Israel, which is, okay, we'll accept you, and we'll accept your legitimacy with the Assad government. And the thought is from the Gulf states and maybe from Israel is that the Americans would also offer the Russians in exchange, we'll back off from the Crimea issue, maybe we'll back off on the sanctions that Ukraine sanctions, etc. Okay. Now, once again, what this demonstrates is the contradictoriness of the whole darn thing, because in American politics, Trump now cannot give Russia anything. He could not back off on sanctions against Russia. He could not back off about Crimea. He said something about that. He did hint, we'll have to see whether they're going to accept Crimea, and they're going to come after him about that. So, Russia's in a position to make deals with these other people who might want to go along with it. But when Lindsey Graham says, well, we could make a deal with Russia, and then goes on to talk about how you can't trust any deals with Russia, he doesn't want to make a deal with Russia. The Americans don't want to make a deal with Russia. So the problem for the United States is that any deal that comes out of this, even if it's one that's relatively beneficial to Israel, is going to come out despite the United States and without the United States being involved in it. And they don't like it. It demonstrates that the American soft power and diplomatic power and power to negotiate and to be perceived as an honest broker is completely gone in the world. I don't know whether this is true. It's hard to fathom exactly what's going on in Russia. And what I will caution about is I don't know who this guy that they quoted there in RT is, Vladimir, but there are factions in Russia that want to be much more accommodating to the United States than Putin is perceived as wanting to be. Although I think Putin himself wants to be a partner with the United States. But, what the Americans have done has created a situation not only for people in the Middle East, but for people in Russia, where even the people who want to be more conciliatory to the United States are now in a position where they have to admit, what the hell are you going to be conciliatory for? Because they don't want to talk to you. Everything that the Russians try to do to create a partnership is met by the United States with these crazy attacks. You try to overturn their elections. You're poisoning people all over the world. You invaded Ukraine and invaded Crimea. So Russia's not getting anything. And what they call the Atlantic integrationists in Russia, as opposed to the Eurasianists, the more Western-oriented, are left now out in the blue because they can't point to anything that you could possibly get from the United States.
And this kind of makes it seem like my view of Russiagate, and I don't believe I think it's 95% bullshit, is that this is kind of the point of Russiagate. It's to kind of pin in Trump from making this kind of deal. Because now because with all these false stories which are leaked out from, nefarious sources, I think this is kind of a rather obvious, I don't want to say deep state or national security state, but clearly there's people there who don't want to make a deal with Russia, or even to basically make any deal with any power that's going to concede a millimeter of U.S. imperial prerogative and territory or sphere of influence, anything, that they have tried to essentially hamstring Trump with this Russiagate thing. Well, you can't make this deal because the minute you do anything, we're going to call you Putin's bitch, and you're sold out, and we've got an investigation going. And so that's, to me, why Russiagate is, and maybe there's some spittle of truth in this whole cocktail of nonsensical crap, but that to me is why it's become a big deal, is because there are forces within the United States security establishment who do not want any kind of deal, any kind of compromise. And look, Trump's going to meet with Putin in Helsinki, but even if he came to the idea that he wants to roll back sanctions, the Maginski Act is an act of law. You can't just roll that back. You'd have to have Congress pass something. And what Congress is going to pass something with all these unending FBI, CIA, deep state, whatever, leaks happening almost on a daily basis to undermine that? Oh, he wants to recognize Crimea, which was taken in response to a U.S. coup of the Ukrainian democratically elected president. Oh, we can't do that. That's appeasement. Nobody's taken territory since Hitler, Stalin, da-da-da-da. Like, so that is this is, I think, what anybody who understands a geopolitical perspective, which is few people in this country, will understand why Russiagate is being fueled, who's fueling it, and what their interest is outside of the other aligned interest of Democratic Party prerogative to weaken an opposition party. And this is it right here. Trump does a Helsinki, and what can he really actually negotiate? Not much.
Well, and you can see in real time, it's not just the United States national security state or the deep state, right? It's an existential issue for NATO, right?
Yeah,
NATO,
too.
A U.S.-Russia rapprochement spells a what? What does it spell for NATO? It certainly shrinks it. It makes it. It doesn't give us the big boogeyman, the big threat. They see
NATO should have been broken up after the Cold War ended. Why is it even still around?
Exactly.
And Trump just, I mean, we just saw this in real time. I mean, Trump just flipped the table at the NATO summit. I mean, that's a whole nother.
Can he even do a withdrawal, though? I mean, even if let's say he gets his dander up and he really decides to make a move, what would happen if he tried to withdraw from NATO? I think Congress would try to overrule him because they're in such a frenzied, hysterical state over this fake story called Russiagate.
Now, any attempt to withdraw from NATO or to undermine NATO, and he came out today earlier and said, no, I believe in NATO. This is Trump's problem now, is that, he's completely clueless about this. I think he says things and he has little big stubs of ideas that he says, let's be friendly with Russia, let's get out of Syria, what are we in NATO? But he can't pursue these things. He has no political apparatus behind him to pursue these things. And the deep state, the national security state, the permanent state is there, and they're going to push him away from that. And I think you're absolutely right. The Russiagate investigation is a caging mechanism to discipline him and to cage him and to keep him from straying too far from the common wisdom and from the establishment consensus. But he's so crazy that he just keeps doing these things. And if he starts saying things and doing things that's on NATO or Russia or Ukraine or Syria, Trump's not only on the threat of impeachment, which is not going to happen, but he's on the threat of the more radical sanction they use for presidents they don't really like.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know if they'll go that far. I think they'd like to, but I just wonder. It is a caging mechanism. That's a perfect term for it. It's not a legit issue. We've gone over this with other people, so let's not delve too far into why Russiagate is nonsense. But it's not so clear. See, Trump is all instinct, and it's almost like he's a blind man feeling his way through a maze, and he just like, well, I'll do this, and so they're putting all these things in front of him to kind of show you, like, this is the consequence. But he's so visceral, he doesn't appreciate it, and so he kind of finds the North Star on some of these issues, like NATO. This is a disaster. Why are we in NATO? He doesn't know why. He doesn't have an intellectual appreciation, but he just sort of viscerally figures out the kind of a move that makes sense, which is, well, why don't we get along with Russia? They got bombs that could kill us. Why would we do that? So I just wonder if that's what their own frustration of the people who are trying to cage him is. that he is not a well-behaved animal like so many other politicians in Washington. But he's also so strong and his supporters so virulent as well as his opponents that it's not clear to me that the people who support Trump would submit themselves to a civil authority if they felt that he was being unfairly impeached or removed or whatever. I'm not so sure they'd agree to accept it, which is something the media seems to be constantly trying to get people to. No, you understand, it's terrible. It's the end of the world. And they're immune to it, which pisses them off to no end because they're immune to the kind of propaganda. So I think it is a caging mechanism. That's perfect.
That's why if you say, well, politically it'd be a disaster for them, for Republicans, certainly, and for anybody, for Republicans to vote to impeach him, his base would be up in arms about it. And what's anybody else going to get? We're going to get Pence and Cruz? What's it for anybody? There's nothing in it for anybody. So if he's not learning his lessons and he's not being tamed and he's not acting like he's learned, okay, stay in the cage, what's the alternative?
Right. Well, the alternative is also that he could destroy them.
Well, that's my point.
Yes, so they might.
That happen. He can't. He's not strong enough to do that. He's a very weak president. He's all bluster, as you say. But he's got no political machine behind him. He's got a constituency, but even they don't know him that well. Really, they just come along and get him for 6 months. They don't. But what I'm saying is, there's a big machine in there that's going to. If it gets to the point where he's too much trouble for them, what are they going to do?
But isn't the machine itself weak at this point? See, I see NATO, these people are freaking out partly because they kind of understand their own, they kind of understand they don't have clothes, to use the emperor has no clothes. They kind of figure how stupid and weak this structure is, and maybe it doesn't matter that it's Trump, it's just breaking anyway.
No, but Trump is demonstrating its weakness more than they want. Trump is
that's what he just did. He just said the emperors have no clothes when he calls out. I mean, he didn't change NATO policy at all. But what he did is he walks in and the first thing he does is he pulls back the curtain. He says, you guys are saying that we need NATO because, Russia's a threat. And yet here you are doing, billions of dollars of business with the Russians. What's up with that? Right?
I
know. So
someone was tweeting that today. Hey, if NATO's only been spending it hasn't even been spending 2% GDP on their. Why can't we do that? That's not because they don't want to. That's because they don't perceive Russia as a threat. They're doing business with them. And
right.
Why do you get them? You got to stop doing business with them and treat them as an enemy. Trump goes in. What's going on here?
And getting back to your caging point too, Jim. The fact that Russiagate is a mechanism. I called it like a lever. It's leverage of power to keep him reined in. But this New Yorker article and all the articles that we talk about will be linked in the show notes for our audience too. But just to tell you which one it is, it's Israeli, Saudi. The title is Israeli, Saudi, and Emirati officials privately pushed for Trump to strike a grand bargain with Putin. And so in this article, they talk about how the UAE, Saudis, and the Israelis are pushing for rapprochement between the United States and Russia for this, rebalancing, this grand bargaining thing for Iran. But Adam Antu, I don't know how you pronounce his name. In this article, he brings up that everything that Mueller is investigating that's related to this attempt at rapprochement and rebalancing the Middle East. He goes into detail about the Trump Tower meeting, the Bannon Prince meeting in the Seychelles. Is that how you pronounce it? Seychelles?
Seychelles, I think.
Yeah. The Trump transition team meetings with Kislyak and the one that was going to be set up between Flynn and Russian generals. And that's Kushner testified to Congress about that. And that's just sort of more indication, or is it? I mean, it's a question. Is Mueller acting as a mechanism to cage Trump's foreign policy to make sure? And is this an indication that this is not something that whoever Mueller is serving, I would say, for lack of a better term, the deep state, look what Mueller's focusing on in his investigation. So I'm just sort of trying to reinforce your point. And
something about that article, which was very interesting, and I hope someone picks it up. When you read that article, suddenly the impetus for better relations for Russia after Trump became elected and before he was nominated came from Israel.
Israel, the Saudis, and
Israel.
Collusion.
And that whole Michael Flynn thing was calling the Russians in order to help them with Israel. So I want to see whether Rachel Maddow and Chris Hayes are going to say, my God, it's Israel who has been pushing Trump to do better with Putin. Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu must be Putin's agent. Let's find the P-tape. Let's go back to 1987 and see when Benjamin Netanyahu became
They won't dare.
Russian agent.
It's also, too, like they talk about the trading Ukraine for Syria proposal that they may be proposing to Putin. They may be proposing, the Saudis, the Israelis, and the United Arab Emirates, for them, Ukraine is not very important. Syria is important, and settling things in their part of the world is important. And then you have the Europeans and NATO, that set of allies. It's like this set of allies and that set of allies. Ukraine is more of a priority for them. And so you have that going on. You got to find out, who Trump favors. Well, I mean, it certainly looks like he favors the Middle Eastern allies, set of allies, doesn't it? And we'll see if they do this trade Ukraine for Syria thing. There's certainly been some indications that this might happen, or they might try to do it. Yeah. But as Jim says, what happens if he does make this deal? I mean, technically, he can make this deal. He's president. He could,
what
in
deal?
Words, he could agree to, to work to reduce the sanctions, to pull back in Ukraine.
He can't reduce the sanctions. I mean, that's what Congress has done. See, that's the perniciousness of the Maginski Act is he actually can't negotiate that.
I'm talking about the Russian sanctions.
And the sanctions he can't stop either.
They're accusing him of not enforcing those sanctions.
It's the EU sanctions that really affect them. But I mean, he can say that he will do it. I understand that he can't physically do it, but he can go in there and he can say that he's going to push that. And he can do that if he wants.
Yeah, and I think probably even in the Magnitsky Act, there's probably that the president can assert that national security requires that blah, blah, blah. Usually in those things, I'm not sure about the specific proposals.
Well, who's pushing the EU sanctions is another interesting question, if that's what they're really concerned about. Because, I mean, Germany's building this pipeline. This is the thing that Trump said is actually correct is like, well, wait a minute. I thought you were sanctioning them. How are you building this was it going to be $1 trillion pipeline?
They want to stop that. The deep state wants to stop that. And Trump, when he's bitching at the Germans about that, is doing the deep state's bidding. They want to stop that pipeline.
Right. Well, they want liquefied natural gas to be shipped across the Atlantic, which is one of the dumbest things I've ever heard in my life. And even the Europeans aren't vassals enough to pay, 20 to 30% more for their energy costs? Because
Are they not? We'll have to see.
I guess we'll see. Touche.
Are they going to stop buying Iranian oil? We'll have to see.
It got me. Maybe they are. Maybe they really are these peons. But of course, that the problem is they're peons for who? They're not. The president of the United States seems not to be particularly fond of them. I mean, it's one thing to be a peon. It's one thing to be peed on.
That's what's good about Trump. He makes it harder for them to do that. And with Barack Obama, we'll do what he says. He's a nice guy.
He's so charismatic.
Everybody knows Trump's an ass, and he's arrogant and a bully. So he's not giving them an easy out. They're going to look like cowering.
Right. Trump and his alpha maleness kind of forces them to humiliate themselves for their own interests.
That's what's good about Trump. He's as Joanne says, he's drawing back the curtain. The lipstick's off the pig. That's what you're doing when you do it to Obama, but it doesn't look like it. Looks like you're being a nice guy to a nice guy. Now you're just doing what the bully tells you to do.
Right.
Oh my God. It's so complicated and it's so bizarre too. I mean, sometimes I wish I didn't understand anything about it because it's so, I don't know. At the same time, if you have some good gallows humor chops, then it can be entertaining too, unfortunately.
Before we wrap up, I wanted to reference this article, The Warm War.
Yeah.
This is in March 31st, 2018, Russia Mania at the Boiling Point.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about this article. It's really interesting. It seems, I remember I wrote way back when a column over at Shadowproof, whatever, Next Cold War or the New Cold War. Even I don't remember at this point.
Yeah.
But it seemed like the Nuland coup, the Nuland-backed or orchestrated coup in Ukraine was a setup for these people trying to reignite the new Cold War. That there was all these former Russia hands who were unemployed in D.C. and needed somehow to justify their existence. There was arms deals to be made that opposition with Russia would justify the F-35 when these Al-Qaeda guys would not. It seemed like it was all kind of aligning, and I wondered, what's your talk about the article a little bit, and what's your take on, I guess, what you wouldn't call it the new Cold War, you call it a warm war.
Yeah, I think it's a little worse, a little more dangerous than the warm war, than the Cold War, for a number of reasons. And I think that you had a situation from the 90s until 2015 or 2014, where the United States started with Clinton in Yugoslavia, who said, we're now going to, the United States and NATO are going to decide where to attack people and where not to, what's the right thing to do in terms of humanitarian intervention and attacking people. And and the Russians didn't want this intervention in Yugoslavia, but they had compliant government in Russia. They had a weak state in Russia. It was destroyed by the Americans economically. And from that point on until 2014, the Americans assumed correctly that militarily, they could intervene militarily in the world wherever they wanted, and nobody could do anything about it. And the Russians weren't even to be thought of as a potential problem. And that began to be stopped in Ukraine when the Russians didn't invade Ukraine, but they clearly backstopped the Eastern Ukrainian opposition, the Eastern Ukrainian movement, and they took Crimea because with a legitimate, I think, referendum, and on the same grounds that the referendum of Kosovo, and said, you did this in Kosovo, we have a referendum just like you had in Kosovo. So the Russians at that point asserted, because Putin had rebuilt Russia strong enough to say, we're not going to just let you get any further. NATO and the U.S. have known they can't crush Eastern Ukraine without getting into conflict with Russia. And then what happened in 2015 in Syria, where everybody thought the Syrian government was going, and it probably was. And what people don't often say or talk about is it was after the Obama administration declared that it would attack Syrian forces in defense of its favored rebels. In other words, it was going to enter the war and militarily attack Syrian forces. It was after that Russia accepted the invitation from Syria to come in. And they stopped that from happening, really. And they interrupted the American imperial project in Syria with military means. And that was a wake-up call. And the Americans don't like that. Now, what I'm saying is, this is why the Americans want to back Russia off. They want to tame it again. They want to get it back to some kind of Yeltsin-ish compliance. And there are forces in Russia that will do that for them. And that's why they want regime change in Russia of some kind. And what I'm saying, the other thing I said about the situation is, now we have a situation in which Russians do not want war. Russians, what was I saying? Russians are afraid of war, but they're prepared for it. The Americans aren't afraid of war, but they're not prepared to fight it. And because America doesn't really have the same experience of war that Russia has on its territory being destroyed. And the Russians do. Vladimir Putin's brother, was killed in the siege of Leningrad. 2 million people starving to death, eating cannibalism. Every Russian knows. They don't want war. They fear war. But they're prepared to fight if they need to. Whereas the Americans think of war as a video game,
In World War II especially, which is ironic because it was the Russians or the Soviets that defeated the German war machine. The Americans did it. They think D-Day defeated Germany. Yeah, the Americans were a mop-up operation. They weren't even in the main combatants. They were done. It was over by the time the Americans came.
Huge effort it was 10 times as many people were killed, and mostly civilians, as American and Brits combined. And so 20 times, I think. So the Americans have this bluster attitude toward war because they keep Americans out of it for the most part. They couldn't finish Vietnam because there were too many American casualties. They can't. 17 years in Afghanistan, they can't win a war. America hasn't won a war, in the sense that they achieved the real. They beat Saddam, they beat Grenada,
Grenada. I was going to say they have Grenada. Don't forget Grenada in Panama.
They overthrew Gaddafi, but there was no real big fighting there. There were tens of thousands of American casualties. You go to war with Russia, there's going to be tens of thousands of American casualties minimum. So, and they're not just going to be over there.
Right. It's going to become a nuclear war. It's going to become a nuclear war.
Very clear about that. And if we are not going to fight a war, we're not going to let a war happen here. And the first people who are going to get killed are the Europeans. And they're playing this very dangerous game. So,
right.
So what I'm saying is, but you're in this situation where a lot of the people who make policy in the United States were formed in the 20 years when you could do anything you want, and Russia was you couldn't. And they're trying to get back to that era. They're trying to recreate an era when the United States had complete impunity and militarily didn't have to worry that Russia. And they're not sure whether they can or they can't yet. And that's a very dangerous situation.
Right. That's the uncertainty. Like, that's the part the article points out, that the underlying current of it that freaks me out still a little bit, which is there are people that really believe they can create this global canopy system of we'll just be the unipolar power in the world, and they refuse to kind of say accept reality. And you know what? Refusal to accept reality can go pretty far if you've got power in Washington. And boy, do these people have power in Washington, and they are just not, when enough people tell you you're drunk, you should lay down.
They're delusional states about the world entirely. And they think they've been pushing Russia, and they pushed in Syria, shoot down a plane. Americans were involved in that, this and that. And there's a threat that they will just keep incrementally escalating and thinking that the Russians won't go the next step, because Putin wants to avoid a major war, and he will do a lot to avoid it and has done a lot to avoid it. So it's a very difficult dance, and it's a very dangerous one, mostly because the Americans involved in it aren't really afraid of that next escalation. They think they can get away with it. They don't.
Right. Yeah, it's like the delusion, and there seems to be this division of people, factions, one of which I think a lot of the same people who were involved in pushing for the Iraq War, they're willing to risk anything for empire. They don't want to lose this dominance, and they can see that we are losing this dominance. And here's the thing that always confuses me, and it also actually bolsters some of the things that you said. Wesley Clark in the infamous, we're going to attack 7 states in 5 years. In the longer version of that speech, what he tells Amy Goodman is he recalls a conversation with Paul Wolfowitz in, I believe it was 1991, right after the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. And he says that he's talking to Wolfowitz. He said to Wolfowitz, "Oh, you must be pretty proud of the, the Gulf War." And Wolfowitz says, "Yeah, but, we should have gone further. We should have taken down Saddam and all this stuff." And Wolfowitz tells him that he lays out, he says, "I figure we've got," and you have to remember the Soviet Union has just fallen at this point. He said, "I figure we've got about 10 years where we can do anything we want in the Middle East, and the Soviets can't stop us." So he lays it out right there. He lays it bare, what their attitude was exactly the attitude that you just described, Jim. But at least at that point in time, he understood that there was a limited amount of time that you could be a sole superpower, that it just really wasn't something that was sustainable. But something happened since then. It's like now that it's actually happening, that it's going to become a multipolar world again. These same people, or some of the same ones, they refuse to, they think that they can stop that from happening. And I think that's the biggest threat, maybe along with climate change. One of the biggest threats of the world right now is that belief or willing to risk everything to maintain the empire. And, I wonder if in this New Yorker article where they say that Israel, the Saudis, and the United Arab Emirates, they're saying that this United Arab Emirates MBZ guy is a real politique. That's his philosophy. And I wonder if, he's saying we should trade Ukraine for Syria, their own interests. But as with Europe, the first casualties are going to be the Europeans. I wonder if in this impending war with Iran, I wonder if the United Arab Emirates see this coming and they realize that they're the ones who are going to, it's not going to be the Americans that are going to suffer first. It's going to be the people in the Middle East. And he probably thinks they are at great risk too. And maybe that's why they're trying to do this rapprochement. And I think there will be a parallel there with the Europeans who are not inclined to, there are some countries and some factions within European countries that want to normalize relations with Russia. Obviously, the ones in Germany that are in favor of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And there's certainly the German industrialists who want, they're tired of these sanctions. There are a lot of Europeans who are suffering from those sanctions. We don't do that much business with Russia. Europe does a lot, or did a lot with Russia. But it's just funny how Wolfowitz laid that out. Like, what happened to the neoconservative and the Uberhawks? What happened between then and now? Or did he not really mean what he said? I don't know.
Well, I think that they've been thinking that they can do what they want militarily and exert their will and enforce compliance. And, that started the military pushback against that, which was really quite shocking to them, started in Ukraine. The diplomatic pushback started in 2013 with the Gouda incident, where the Russians outfoxed them diplomatically with the deal with Assad to get rid of the nuclear weapons. They were going to attack Syria, then I'm convinced of it.
I think that triggered, it could be argued that triggered the coup in Ukraine, that was the retaliation.
That's right. I agree. I tend to agree. In other words, at that point, the Americans started to get Russia pushed back in a way that was not supposed to do that. But it wasn't a military pushback. It was a diplomatic. Ukraine, that was kind of that was in the background, the military pushback. No, they're not going to just go into eastern Ukraine and crush these dissident, these opponents who are pissed off because you overthrew a legitimately elected government with a fascist government. I mean, fascist, Nazis, flat out Nazis. and
they're just misguided, Jim. They're just misguided. They're just a liberal, right?
I mean,
the glory to Ukraine is just a patriotic thing. It's not.
Oh, it's
not
just about Stefan Bandera. He had some good ideas.
Oh God.
I mean, the kind of the back and forth in Ukraine is so hilarious. But to the larger point, Jim, I think it's absolutely there's this people who want this warm war with Russia, but the problem that they actually faced in Syria when after Ghouta, and the problem that I think Trump will face in Iran is the American people have had it with this. In fact, his election is a very testament to that opposition.
Exactly.
So in the event he tries to start this war with Iran, first off, his supporters are going to be incredibly demoralized, which they actually kind of were when he bombed Syria. There was a lot of opposition from the Trump group people, Trumpkins, whatever you want to call them. They were saying, wait a minute, what the hell is this? We don't want to be involved in this. And also the Democratic Party, which is, crass opportunists, they're not going to rally around him if a war starts with Iran. They're not going to rally around him. They'll try, but they've stoked that quote hashtag resistance a little too much for I think many people to ever get behind Trump, even if it's a war. I see you may be skeptical. I think it's out of their control. They will not be able to control the resistance if that happens.
Listen, I wish that were true. But the Democratic Party could win every damn election there is from now to kingdom come by saying we're against all these damn wars. We don't want to go to war with Iran. We don't want to go to war with Syria. We're for Medicare for all. We're for a jobs guarantee. We're for housing. They win every election. But they're not going to do it. What they're doing is they're running on Vladimir. Donald Trump is a Russian agent. He was recruited by Gorbachev in 1987. Now he's run by That's their electoral strategy. This is stupidity.
Right, but Yes, the DNC.
In principle, they do not support those other things.
Right.
And at least half of them do want a war with Iran. They will go to war. And nobody talks about it.
The elected officials will absolutely get behind a war with Iran. I just don't think the rank and file of the Democratic Party that has been so energized and is also engaged in the demonization campaign of Trump, especially, the children at the border, all these things, women, pussy grabber, can flip like a Chuck Schumer can flip and say, oh, we're going to rally around the president in time of war. I actually think Trump would have intense, uncharacteristic internal opposition, domestic opposition.
It would have to be in the street. Is Trump?
I think it could be. I really think it's that bad.
Are there going to be more people demonstrating in the street against the war against Iran than there were against the war on Iraq? I was out in the street with millions of people all around the world, the biggest demonstrations in the history of anti-war around the world, millions.
You make a strong point. I'm just wondering, can they turn this train around? They'd have to turn this hate fest, this daily hate fest against Trump. They'd have to turn it completely around in a period of moments to make it work for him to rally around support. I mean, how can they go from saying this guy is the worst guy in the world? I mean, I agree they'll try, maybe they'll try. I mean, how does MSNBC how does Rachel Maddow do that? I don't just
what did they say after Trump attacked Syria with the missiles?
Oh, that's true.
I'll have to put Brian Williams out there.
Fareed Zakaria. Rachel Maddow.
He's big president now. He's president now.
Now he's president.
Yeah, yesterday I was listening to NPR on the radio, and they were all totally confused. They were like, could the Trump visit to the NATO summit, could that be considered a success? And I'm like, wait a minute, is that NPR? Yeah, that's NPR I have on. Yeah, I mean.
You know what, Jim? You're right. You might be right. I try to be cynical, but I can't keep up.
It's hard to be cynical.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for talking about that article. And we kept you a while here.
Thank you.
And where can people find your work?
I'll say I got a very nice, really honored to have gotten a very nice email from Ray McGovern about that article, who liked it very much. And he's a guy who knows that issue. So
that's a great article. People should read it. We'll plug the website too, thepolemicist.net. And this article is The Warm War, Russia Mania at the Boiling Point.
Yeah.
And people can follow you on Twitter. What is it? At
polemicist _.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, guys.
Yeah, it was great talking with you, Jim. I hope you'll come back on again. Shoot the bull with us.
It's a nice format. It's a very nice format. It's relaxed. Great. All right. Take it easy.
All right. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Take care, Jim.
And that's our show. I want to thank you for listening, and a special thank you to Jim Kavanagh for coming on the show. Follow Jim on Twitter at @thepolemicist_ and read his work at thepolemicist.net and counterpunch.org.
We're independent media. This podcast is brought to you with the help of our generous donors. You can pitch in by going to patreon.com/aroundtheempire or by doing one-time donations at our website, aroundtheempire.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and our podcast channels at iTunes and other podcast apps. On YouTube, it helps a lot if you hit the subscribe button. Subscribe to the channel, that's free. And also, use the thumbs up icon to like the videos. Also, please like our page on Facebook.
Questions, comments, want to yell at me? Dan at aroundtheempire.com. Please follow us on Twitter at Around the Empire. You can follow me at US Empire Show. Follow Joanne at Joanne Leon, Leon. See you next time.
Take care, everybody.